Dan Serafini seemed to have it all. He had the arm that could throw a blistering fastball, he was a first-round draft pick, and he built a career in the major leagues with thousands of adoring fans. He stood on the mound in packed stadiums as the hero of the moment, a man who reached the very pinnacle of his profession. His name was on baseball cards and in sports headlines, a true symbol of athletic achievement. But today, the only uniform he wears is a prison jumpsuit. The roar of the crowd has been replaced by the chilling clang of a cell door. On July 15, 2025, a jury found Dan Serafini guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder.
The jury, in the above-entitled action, find the defendant, Daniel Joseph Serafini, guilty of a violation of California Penal Code Section 187A, murder, a felony as charged in count 1.
This is the story of how a celebrated athlete became a cold-blooded murderer, orchestrating a brutal execution-style attack on his own family. It's a story about the dark and winding road that can lead from a baseball diamond to a lifetime behind bars, and how a lifelong dream can curdle into an absolute nightmare. Daniel Joseph Serafini was born in San Francisco, California, and from an early age, baseball was his calling. He was a standout player at Junipero Serra High School in San Mateo, the same prestigious school that produced legends like Barry Bonds and Tom Brady. With a powerful left arm and a fierce competitive streak, he seemed destined for greatness. In 1992, that destiny felt all but guaranteed when the Minnesota Twins selected him in the first round of the MLB draft, the 26th overall pick. For an 18-year-old kid, it was the ultimate dream come true. He started his professional journey in the minor leagues, working his way up through teams like the Fort Wayne Wizards and the New Britain Rock Cats, where he even became an all-star. His major league debut came on June 25, 1996, for the Minnesota Twins. Stepping onto that mound for the first time was the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. He would go on to play for multiple MLB teams over the next decade, including the Chicago Cubs, Pittsburgh Pirates, San Diego Padres, and Cincinnati Reds. His career wasn't just confined to the United States. Serafini also took his talents abroad, playing professionally in Japan, Mexico, and Taiwan. He was a journeyman pitcher, a baseball globetrotter who lived a life most people can only fantasize about. He was part of an elite fraternity of athletes, earning millions and living a life of celebrity. By all accounts, he was a success story. But the hard truth about professional sports is that the glory doesn't last forever. For every long-tenured superstar, there are hundreds of players like Dan Serafini, whose careers eventually end. The roar of the crowd fades, the phone stops ringing, and the structure that has defined your entire life suddenly vanishes. For many athletes, this transition is the hardest game they'll ever have to play. They're left with a haunting question: what comes next? For Dan Serafini, the answer led down a path of financial ruin, resentment, and ultimately, unimaginable violence. Life after baseball proved to be a difficult adjustment for Dan Serafini. The structure and adrenaline of professional sports were gone, and he struggled to fill the void. He had made a lot of money during his career, but a combination of bad investments and a bitter divorce reportedly wiped out a large portion of his fortune. Trying to find a new path, Serafini convinced his parents to take out a hefty loan against their house so he could buy a bar in Sparks, Nevada, which he named the Bullpen. In 2015, the bar was featured on the reality TV show Bar Rescue, where Serafini was shown as a man drowning in debt, with an unruly staff and a failing business. He admitted on the show that he was $300,000 in debt and on the verge of losing everything, including his parents' home. He lamented the tough transition from baseball to business, saying, "My parents were so proud of me at one time for being a successful baseball player, and now, I'm just thinking what a disappointment I am to everybody." It was during this period of financial and personal turmoil that a deadly conflict began to brew. Serafini was married to Gary Spohr, the daughter of Robert Spohr and Wendy Wood. The couple and their children seemed to be building a life together. Erin was passionate about horses, and her wealthy parents loaned the couple roughly $1.3 million to help her start a horse ranch. It was a generous sum meant to give their daughter and son-in-law a stable future. Instead, it became a source of deep-seated resentment and rage. The relationship between Serafini and his in-laws grew increasingly toxic. Prosecutors later revealed a series of angry emails and text messages that showed a family at war. The financial disputes were constant and bitter. Serafini felt he and his wife were being controlled and disrespected. His mother-in-law, Wendy Wood, once sent him a message that cut deep, "You were an exceptional athlete, but your anger got in the way." In another message to her daughter Erin, she wrote, "Danny resents us, just like his white trash family." Robert Spohr was just as blunt, at one point telling his own daughter, "Fuck both of you." The anger festered. At his bar, Serafini would openly complain about his in-laws to customers, calling them wealthy pieces of shit. The man once celebrated as a sports hero was now consumed by a different kind of fire, a burning hatred for his wife's parents. Prosecutors later alleged that this hatred grew so intense Serafini told others he'd be willing to pay $20,000 to have them killed. The pressure of his failed businesses, his mounting debts, and his seething anger was creating a perfect storm. And on a quiet summer day in Lake Tahoe, that storm would finally break. June 5, 2021. The community of Homewood, nestled on the picturesque west shore of Lake Tahoe, is known for its serene beauty and multi-million-dollar homes. It's a place where people go to escape, a quiet haven of pine trees and sparkling blue water. But on this day, that tranquility was shattered by an act of horrific, calculated violence. Inside their home, 70-year-old Robert Spohr and his 68-year-old wife, Wendy Wood, were relaxing and watching television. They had no idea an intruder had already slipped into their house and was lying in wait, hidden from view, preparing to carry out an execution. The attacker wasn't a random burglar. This was personal. This was an ambush. The assailant, his face hidden by a mask and a hoodie, emerged from the shadows and opened fire. Robert Spohr was shot once in the head and killed instantly. Wendy Wood was shot twice, also in the head. Miraculously, she survived the initial attack. After the shooter was gone, Wendy, gravely wounded, somehow managed to regain consciousness and make the most important phone call of her life. She called 911. When first responders arrived, they walked into a scene of unimaginable horror. They found Robert Spohr dead and his wife Wendy fighting for her life. The evidence immediately suggested this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It was a targeted assassination. The community was gripped by fear. Who would commit such a brutal crime in this peaceful town? The investigation began, but for a long time, there were no answers. Wendy Wood, the sole survivor, endured extensive rehabilitation but couldn't identify her attacker. The trauma she suffered was immense, not just from her physical injuries, but from the psychological terror of the attack and the loss of her husband. Tragically, a year after the shooting, Wendy Wood died by suicide. Her family said she simply couldn't go on without her husband and with the unresolved horror of what had happened. The case went cold. The masked figure who committed this heinous act seemed to have vanished without a trace, leaving a family destroyed and a community searching for answers. But investigators from the Placer County Sheriff's Office were determined. They refused to let this case go unsolved and began the slow, painstaking process of digging through records, following digital footprints, and chasing down every possible lead. They were convinced the key to this brutal murder was hidden somewhere in the victims' lives, and they wouldn't stop until they found it. For more than 2 years, the investigation into the murder of Robert Spohr and the attempted murder of Wendy would seem to be at a standstill. The trail had gone cold, and justice felt impossibly distant. The key to the case was a grainy piece of surveillance footage from the Spohr's own security system. It showed a figure, completely obscured by a hoodie, mask, and gloves, entering the home on the day of the attack. It was a chilling image, a ghost who appeared, committed an unspeakable act of violence, and then disappeared. But who was it? Detectives from the Placer County Sheriff's Office worked tirelessly, knowing the answer was out there. They started to focus on the family's contentious relationships, particularly the well-documented financial disputes with their son-in-law, Dan Serafini. They began to dig deep into his life, examining cell phone records, GPS data, and financial transactions, hoping to find a crack in his story. Slowly, they began to piece together a timeline. They discovered that on the day of the murder, Dan Serafini wasn't where he claimed to be. Cell phone data placed him in the Lake Tahoe area, a fact he had tried to hide. But this alone wasn't enough. They needed more to connect him directly to the crime. Scott was a friend of Serafini's wife, Erin, and had worked for the family as a nanny and helped at the horse ranch. Investigators soon discovered that she and Dan Serafini were having an affair. This discovery opened up a whole new line of investigation. When they looked at her phone records, they found she and Serafini were in constant communication, and their digital trail began to paint a very suspicious picture. Investigators now had a motive: the bitter financial dispute. They had a suspect who was in the area at the time of the crime. And now they had a potential accomplice. They just needed something to tie it all together, a witness who could break the case wide open. They decided to put pressure on Samantha Scott, believing she was the weak link. After initially lying to cover for Serafini, the weight of the evidence became too much. The cold trail was finally heating up, and the ghost from the surveillance video was about to get a name. Before we reveal the shocking breakthrough that turned this entire case on its head, take a quick moment to support our channel. If you're finding this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us continue to bring you in-depth true crime stories just like this one. Now, let's get back to the investigation and the moment everything changed. The breakthrough investigators were searching for finally came when Samantha Scott, facing the pressure of the investigation and the possibility of a life sentence, decided to talk. In February 2024, she agreed to a plea deal, pleading guilty to being an accessory to the crime in exchange for her testimony against the man she once had an affair with, Dan Serafini. Her testimony was the key that unlocked the entire case. Scott became the prosecution's star witness, and the story she told in court was absolutely chilling. She revealed that on the day of the murder, she drove Dan Serafini to the Lake Tahoe area. She testified that he was carrying a backpack with a handgun inside. In a particularly damning piece of testimony, she recalled how, on the drive up, Serafini had her pull over so he could test-fire the weapon into a sandhill. He wasn't just carrying a gun, he was making sure it worked. According to Scott, the gun was even fitted with a makeshift silencer Serafini had crafted himself out of PVC pipe. She told the jury she dropped Serafini off less than 2 miles from his in-laws' home and then waited. When he returned to the vehicle, he was no longer carrying the backpack. As they drove away from Lake Tahoe, she said she watched as Serafini began throwing items out of the truck's window, evidence he was desperately trying to get rid of. Scott also confessed that Serafini had told her about the shooting afterward. She testified that he admitted he had shot Wendy twice in the head, and she had survived. The confession, she said, left her shocked. She also claimed Serafini coached her on a cover story. If anyone asked, they were to say they had gone to Elko, Nevada, to look at a truck. It was a lie designed to create an alibi, but it was a lie that was falling apart under the weight of her testimony and the mountain of digital evidence investigators had collected. The prosecution now had their case. They had a clear motive rooted in years of financial conflict. They had cell phone evidence placing both Serafini and Scott in the area. And now, they had a cooperating witness who provided a detailed first-hand account of the murder plot. The image of the celebrated athlete was now completely shattered, replaced by the portrait of a man so consumed by rage and greed that he would plot the murder of his own family. In October 2023, more than 2 years after the brutal attack in Homewood, the investigation came to a dramatic end. Acting on the evidence they had painstakingly gathered, law enforcement moved in. Dan Serafini and Samantha Scott were arrested in Nevada. The news sent shockwaves through the sports world and the communities in Lake Tahoe and Reno. The former MLB pitcher, the local bar owner, was now accused of being a cold-blooded killer. Serafini and Scott were extradited to California to face the charges. The Placer County District Attorney's Office charged Serafini with first-degree murder, attempted murder and burglary, adding special circumstance allegations of lying in wait and committing a murder during a felony. A conviction would mean a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole. The trial began in May of 2025. Over 6 weeks, the jury heard the entire chilling story. They saw the toxic text messages that laid bare the hatred between Serafini and his in-laws. They listened to the harrowing testimony of Samantha Scott, who detailed the plot from start to finish. The defense argued that Scott was an unreliable witness who only cooperated to save herself, and they pointed out that the murder weapon was never found. But in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. On July 15, 2025, after 2.5 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Daniel Joseph Serafini guilty on all counts: first-degree murder of Robert Spohr, attempted murder of Wendy Wood, and first-degree burglary. They also found the special circumstance allegations to be true. As the verdict was read, the victim's youngest daughter, Adrienne, sobbed in the front row. Across the courtroom, Serafini's wife, Erin, the woman who stood by him throughout the trial, also wept. The fall of Dan Serafini is a story of profound tragedy. A man who achieved the American dream, who reached the highest levels of his profession, fell so far. His journey from a first-round draft pick to a convicted murderer is a chilling reminder of how ambition, when corrupted by anger and greed, can lead to the darkest places imaginable. He traded a legacy on the baseball field for a legacy of violence and betrayal. Dan Serafini is scheduled to be sentenced on August 18th, where he faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The pitcher who once played for thousands will now spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, the cheers of the crowd a distant, faded echo. The case leaves us with haunting questions. What happens when the spotlight fades and the cheering stops? And what dark impulses can lie dormant, hidden behind a public smile, just waiting for a moment to surface and destroy everything in their path? This case is a complex and devastating look at how family disputes can escalate to the ultimate tragedy. What are your thoughts on the Dan Serafini case? Do you believe the pressure of his post-athletic life was a major factor? Let us know your perspective in the comments below. And for more deep dives into true crime stories, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.
Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more gripping true crime breakdowns, mysteries, and criminal psychology stories, only on Twisted Case.